When the Green Valley HOA tried to bulldoze my family's land for their high-end wellness center, they had no idea I'd spent months crafting the perfect trap. They swallowed the bait, hook, line, and sinker. But how did I turn their greed into the sweetest victory our town had ever seen? The paper cut from the official HOA notice stung my finger as I stood by my mailbox in rural Oregon, but what hurt more were the words on the page. After review of neighborhood boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as communal property. I read it twice, my hands trembling. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. I headed straight to Margaret Langston's house, the new HOA president, with her pristine front lawn and even more polished smile. She opened the door in yoga pants, not even pretending to hide her irritation. "Can I help you, Jonah? This letter says you're claiming my land. There must be some kind of mistake," I said, trying to stay calm. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "No mistake. Our certified surveyor determined your grandfather's hand-drawn maps were inaccurate. The board voted unanimously last night." "Without even notifying me? I've been paying property taxes on that land for 15 years. She inspected her perfectly manicured nails. "The HOA bylaws don't require owner notification for property corrections. We're planning a beautiful community-style pool there. It'll benefit everyone, even you." I was about to respond when music suddenly blasted from next door, the Hendersons' yard. Margaret's smile turned real for the first time. "I should head over. Chris and Lila are hosting the neighborhood welcome bash. You should stop by. It might help you, adjust." As I walked home, the music only got louder. Through the wooden fence, I saw the Hendersons and their guests laughing by their sleek new pool, built suspiciously close to the back edge of my property. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The bass pulsed until 1 a.m. I tried calling Chris twice. No answer. At 1:15, I knocked on their door. Chris opened it, red-faced and holding a beer. "Hey man, party's over. What's up?" "It's almost 1:30. Some of us have work tomorrow." Lila appeared behind him. "We shut the music off right at 1. We checked the bylaws." Chris cut in. "Margaret said we're good until 1. If you can hear people talking, that's not our problem." I took a breath. "Speaking of Margaret, did you know the HOA's plan to claim my back acre?" Their guilty expressions said everything. "You did. You knew they were taking it." "Not taking," Lila corrected. "Reallocating. The new resort's going to have a lap pool, cabanas, and even a juice bar." "On my land?" Chris shrugged. "It's not personal. Margaret showed us the updated survey. Your grandfather's maps were off." Back home, I couldn't sleep. I dug out my grandfather's old wooden chest from the attic. Inside, I found the original property deeds, yellowed with time. I laid them across the kitchen table, comparing them to the HOA survey Margaret had attached to her letter. Something didn't add up. Grandpa's boundaries followed natural landmarks, the stream, the old oak, and the rocky ridge. The HOA's map ignored all of them, cutting perfect, convenient lines through the most beautiful part of the acre. Then I noticed tiny writing in the corner of the deed, a reference to county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed, I had a shot, but I'd need help. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Martin Reyes, a retired surveyor who once worked with my dad. I texted him, even though it was 3 a.m. The next morning, I called in sick and drove to the county records office. My cousin Anthony worked there, and I needed access to the original surveys. "These HOA folks," Anthony muttered as we sifted through dusty files. "They're getting more aggressive every year." "Here it is." He pulled out a thick folder. The 1952 county survey clearly showed our property extended farther than even I had thought. The stream had shifted course during a flood in the 70s, but the property lines hadn't. My phone buzzed again, a text from Margaret. Community notice. Groundbreaking for Green Valley Wellness Resort begins Tuesday. Please remove any personal items from the designated area. Tuesday. That gave me 5 days. On my way home, I passed the Henderson house again. Contractors were unloading a bigger sound system for their next party. Chris waved like we were best friends. That afternoon, Martin arrived with his gear. "Let's find those old markers," he said. "If they're still here, the HOA is in serious trouble." We worked until sunset, staying hidden behind my shed. Beneath decades of overgrowth, Martin's metal detector picked up something. "First marker is here," he said, eyes wide. "According to this, your land extends another 50 feet, including part of the Hendersons' new pool." We found 3 more markers before dark. Each one confirmed it. My property was bigger than even I had believed. "There's more," Martin said quietly. "See this ridge? The Geological Survey from the 1950s marked this as a potential archaeological site. Native American artifacts were reported here in the 40s. I remembered Grandpa's stories about arrowheads and clay pots. I'd always assumed they were just family legends. What does that mean legally?
It could trigger a historical preservation review, meaning no development would be allowed. That night, another party started next door. This time, I smiled as the music blared. Let them enjoy it while they still could. Around 8 p.m., my doorbell rang. It was Grace Miller, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street, holding a casserole. "Thought you might need some dinner with all that racket next door," she said warmly. I invited her in, and before I knew it, I was telling her everything. Grace listened patiently, then shook her head. "Margaret's been pulling stunts like this for years. She forced the Westbrooks out last summer with bogus violations. Their house now belongs to her daughter." "Why doesn't anyone do something?" I asked. "Fear. She's close friends with the mayor's wife." Then her eyes lit up. "But I taught American history for 40 years, volunteered at the State Museum, too. I know a thing or two about preservation law." As she left, she paused at the door. "This land means something to you, doesn't it? More than just the value." I thought of Grandpa teaching me to fish in the stream, of Dad building the treehouse on the old oak. "It's my history," I said. "Then fight for it," she said simply. That night, lying in bed, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "A special HOA meeting isn't necessary," Margaret said flatly. "This decision's already been made." "Then so is my next step," I replied calmly. "Are you threatening me?" Her voice hardened. "Just following the proper procedures, like documenting the original boundary markers your survey somehow missed." Silence. "What markers?" "The ones from 1952. Reyes found them this morning." I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "Those old markers aren't relevant to modern surveys." "The county assessor's office disagrees. I spoke with them today." Another long pause. "We'll discuss this tomorrow. In the meantime, stay off the common areas." "You mean my property? I'll be using all of it, thanks." I hung up, feeling more confident than I had in weeks. Moments later, Anthony called back.
"You struck a nerve," he said. "Margaret just submitted an emergency request to access all your property records." "Too late," I said. "I've already flagged my parcel with a preliminary historical preservation review. Nothing can be developed while it's pending." That evening, I invited Grace and Martin over to plan our next steps. We spread out maps across the kitchen table when headlights suddenly swept across the window. "Someone's here," Grace said, peeking through the curtains. "It's Margaret and the Hendersons." Before I could react, my phone buzzed. A flood of messages from neighbors popped up. "You okay? Saw Margaret headed your way with a sheriff. Tyler's saying you threatened him." Martin looked grim. "They're escalating, trying to intimidate you." "Let them try," I said, gathering our documents into a folder. The doorbell rang, followed by loud, urgent knocking. I opened the door to find Margaret, Tyler, Leela, and a sheriff's deputy. "Evening, folks," I said calmly. "What brings you here so late?" Margaret stepped forward. "Jonah, this is Deputy Wilson. We're concerned about your erratic behavior today." Tyler jumped in, nodding eagerly. "He threatened me, right in front of my family." My jaw dropped. "That's completely false." The deputy looked uneasy. "Sir, I understand there's a property dispute, but threatening neighbors—" "I never threatened anyone," I said firmly, "and I have witnesses." I gestured toward Grace's house. Her security camera was pointed directly at my backyard. The deputy's demeanor shifted. "Is that so?" Margaret cut in quickly. "This isn't just about today. We're concerned about Jonah's mental state. He's making wild claims about property lines that were settled years ago." I let out a short laugh. "Settled? You just resurveyed them last month." Leela chimed in. "He's been obsessed with our property since we moved in, always watching, complaining about noise. Because you built on my land and throw parties until 1 a.m., I snapped. "Okay, everyone, take a breath," the deputy said. "This sounds like a civil dispute, not a criminal matter." Margaret pressed on. "He's been digging on community property without permission. He's destroying landscaping." "You mean my land?" I said, opening the folder and handing the deputy a stack of documents. Martin's updated survey, the original 1952 deed, and photographs of the boundary markers we'd found. "These prove the HOA survey is inaccurate. They're trying to claim almost 2 acres of my legal property." The deputy flipped through the documents. Margaret stood silently, her face tense. "Ma'am, this appears to be a legitimate property disagreement. It needs to be resolved through civil channels, not law enforcement." Margaret tried to object, but he cut her off. "Unless you have actual evidence of threats or trespassing, there's nothing criminal here." He handed the papers back to me. "I suggest both parties contact their attorneys." As they turned to leave, I called out, "Margaret, one more thing. You might want to tell your friends at Lakeside Development that the county has officially opened a historical preservation review on my property." Margaret froze mid-step. She turned, her face pale. "How did you—" she started, then stopped herself. "Too late." The deputy glanced between us, sensing something deeper at play. "Have a good night," I said pleasantly, closing the door on Margaret's stunned expression. Inside, Grace, Martin, and I exchanged quiet smiles of victory. But we knew the fight wasn't over. "They'll come back with lawyers next," Martin warned. "Let them," I replied, tapping the folder. "We've got the truth." Grace gave a knowing smile. "And tomorrow we'll have even more. I arranged for a friend of mine, an archaeologist, to examine those artifacts Maria found." My phone buzzed. A message from Anthony. "Found the connection. Margaret's husband is CFO at Lakeside Development. They just filed plans for vacation rentals in your neighborhood." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about a resort pool. They wanted my land for a much bigger commercial project. "We need to alert the neighbors," I said. "Already happening," Grace replied, holding up her phone. "Our neighborhood chat thread is lighting up with messages about Margaret's connections to the development firm." One final message came in from an unknown number. "HOA emergency meeting called for 7 a.m. tomorrow. All board members required. Code red." Martin chuckled. "Looks like someone's panicking." I should have felt relieved, but something in my gut twisted. "They're not giving up," I said. "Margaret has too much invested." As if summoned by my words, the floodlights across my backyard suddenly flickered on, blindingly bright. Construction lights, newly mounted on the Hendersons' property, blasted directly into my house. The glare poured through every window, blinding and relentless. "What the?" Martin muttered. Grace squinted through the brightness. "There's someone out there, by your shed." Shielding my eyes, I could just barely make out figures moving across my yard. They were pulling up my boundary flags. The low rumble of heavy machinery jolted me awake again at 4:30 a.m. I scrambled to the window and saw a massive yellow bulldozer crawling toward the back of my property. Hands shaking, I grabbed my phone, deed documents, and a flashlight and bolted outside in my slippers. "Stop! Right now!" I shouted, waving the flashlight like a warning beacon. The bulldozer's headlights hit me full force, its steel blade gleaming under the pre-dawn sky. The operator, a heavy-set man in a hard hat, finally cut the engine. "Look, buddy, I'm just following orders. Got paperwork right here says this is HOA land." "Well, your paperwork is wrong," I said, voice trembling but firm. "I have the original markers and deeds. This land has been in my family for generations." My grandfather's old advice echoed in my head. Always know your lines. Always be ready to defend them. A moment later, 3 SUVs pulled into my driveway. Headlights swept over the lawn. Margaret stepped out of her white BMW Range Rover, dressed in a sharply tailored pantsuit, despite the ungodly hour. Behind her came Chris and Lila Henderson, along with 2 unfamiliar men in suits carrying briefcases. "Mr. Barrett, you're an early riser too. Wonderful. You can witness the groundbreaking ceremony." I held up my phone. "I've already called Sheriff Daniels. He's on his way. You're trespassing on private property." "Actually," she replied smoothly, unfolding a document from her leather folder, "according to the county survey we commissioned, this land falls within community boundaries. We're being quite generous with our compensation package." Chris smirked. "Time to join the winning team, Barrett. This resort's going to raise everyone's property value." I stood my ground, feeling the cool, damp grass under my bare feet. "I filed an emergency injunction yesterday. This land is protected under a pending historical review. I've got markers dating back to 1952 to prove it." Margaret's brow twitched. An injunction? How inconvenient. She turned to one of the suited men. "Harold, call Judge Keaton. Wake him if you have to." A distant siren cut through the tense silence. Moments later, Sheriff Daniels, my father's old fishing buddy, pulled up in his patrol SUV, looking irritated and undercaffeinated. "What's going on here?" he asked as he got out, adjusting his belt. Margaret stepped forward, hand extended. "Good morning, Sheriff. Small misunderstanding over boundaries. Nothing serious." "Nothing serious?" I echoed, my voice rising. "They're trying to steal my land." The sheriff looked between us. Ma'am, do you have permits for this equipment? And are you aware of the no construction ordinance before 7 a.m. in residential zones? Margaret hesitated. We have HOA authorization. That's not what I asked, he cut in. County code requires city permits and posted signage. I don't see either. While they argued, I spotted Grace approaching in her robe, clutching a bundle of aged documents. Her pace was slow, but her intent was steady. She called out across the yard, "Margaret, you might want to look at these before you make a mess you can't clean up." Margaret waved her off. "Not now, Grace." Grace ignored her and handed the stack to me. "Your grandfather and I prepared for something like this back in '89. The HOA pulled the same trick with the Crawfords property." I flipped through the yellowed pages, old meeting minutes and boundary maps, clearly showing our original HOA board had filed official records with the state, not just the county. "Sheriff," I said, holding up the documents, "I'd like to file for harassment, and I want these people and their machinery off my land, now." Margaret's phone buzzed. She turned away to take the call, her expression darkening. When she came back, her tone had changed. "There appears to be a paperwork discrepancy," she announced stiffly. "We'll postpone the project while we clarify the details." The bulldozer operator looked relieved as he climbed down. "So we're not digging today?" he asked. "No, pack it up," Margaret snapped. As the crew began to leave, I noticed neighbors gathering near the property line, many of them holding up their phones, recording everything. Margaret noticed too. Her jaw tightened as she marched back to her car. "This isn't over, Barrett," she said coldly. "The board votes tomorrow to invoke our emergency powers clause. I suggest you come prepared and with a reasonable offer." Sheriff Daniels waited until their convoy pulled away before turning to me. "Your dad always said the HOA would pull something like this once he was gone. You hanging in there?" I nodded, suddenly aware of the fatigue weighing me down. "I'll be fine," I said, "but I need to get ready for tomorrow." Grace rested her hand on my arm. "You're not alone, dear. Some of us remember."
People used to remember how this neighborhood started, before folks like Margaret tried to turn it into their own private country club. As we stood in my yard watching the sunrise, my phone buzzed with a message from Jacobson. "Found something big in the county archives. Meet me at 9. Bring coffee. Lots of it." I glanced up at the neighbors still standing near my property. A few offered supportive waves. Others quickly turned away. The battle lines were being drawn, and tomorrow's vote would reveal exactly who stood where. "You can't go in there." Margaret's assistant blocked my path as I approached the double doors of the Ridgewood Community Center. "The emergency HOA meeting started 20 minutes early," she added smugly. "Actually, I can," I replied, pushing past her and gripping the handle of my leather briefcase. Inside were the results of an all-night research session with Jacobson, documents that would turn this whole situation upside down. Heads turned as I walked down the center aisle. The room was packed, more than 100 people, some I'd known for years, others who had only recently moved in, lured by Margaret's pitch of a resort-style upgrade to the community. Margaret stood at the podium mid-sentence. Her crimson lipstick matched her blazer, both as sharp as her tone. "As I was saying before the interruption," she said, "the vote to invoke our Community Enhancement Clause requires a 2/3 majority." "Before anyone votes," I said, projecting my voice, "you should know what you're really voting on." Her manicured fingers gripped the microphone. "Mr. Barrett, you are out of order. We're following Robert's Rules of Order." "Funny you mention rules," I said, "because I've spent the night learning just how many you've broken." Whispers rippled across the room. I spotted the Hendersons in the front row.
Chris nervously tugging at his collar. 3 rows back, Grace gave me an encouraging nod. "Point of order," called out Harold, Margaret's lawyer and longtime enabler. "This isn't on the agenda." "The agenda was changed without proper notice," I shot back. "Section 5 of your own bylaws requires 72 hours of notice for emergency meetings with no changes allowed after distribution." Harold clamped his mouth shut. Several neighbors murmured in agreement. I stepped to the front where the board sat. "I request 10 minutes to present key information before any vote takes place." Board member Diane McCow, who'd always been reasonable despite her friendship with Margaret, raised her hand. "I move that Mr. Barrett be allowed to speak." "Seconded," came a few voices in unison. Margaret's smile strained, but she stepped aside. "Very well, 10 minutes." I pulled out 3 oversized maps and laid them across the presentation table. This first document is the original 1952 survey of Ridgewood Hills. Note the natural creek boundary that defined the western edge of my family's property. I pointed to the winding blue line. That creek created a legal and natural divide between private land and community-owned space. But after the flood of '78, the creek shifted. "Ancient history," Margaret interrupted. "Our recent survey—" "Your survey," I continued, "conveniently ignores those original boundary markers. According to state law, those markers remain legally binding, even when natural features shift." I revealed Jacobson's newly certified survey, showing red lines that extended well beyond the area the HOA claimed. "State law and county records both confirm my property includes all this land," I gestured, "which unfortunately includes portions many of you thought were yours." Gasps rippled through the crowd as people began connecting the dots. "That's impossible," Chris Henderson said, his voice cracking. "Afraid not," I replied. "Your swimming pool extends 12 feet on my property, and Margaret's home addition from last spring, 18 feet over the line." All eyes turned to Margaret. Her mask of composure slipped for the first time. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Your survey was conducted by your brother-in-law's company," I said evenly, "a direct conflict of interest, which I've detailed in this ethics complaint filed this morning with the state licensing board." I handed copies to each board member. "But there's something even more important." I removed a sealed plastic bag from my briefcase and held it up. Inside were what looked like ancient stone tools. "During our certified survey yesterday, we discovered these artifacts. The county archaeologist has done a preliminary assessment. These date back around 800 years. The room fell into dead silence. "I've already filed for historical preservation status," I added, "which means no development can occur within 200 feet of the discovery site. That includes the entirety of my land." Grace stood slowly and walked to the front of the room. "I was there when we found them," she said. "As an amateur archaeologist, I knew immediately they were significant." Margaret's lawyer leaned in to whisper urgently, but she pushed him away. "This is just a delay tactic," she hissed. "We have investors waiting, contracts signed." Her words hung in the air like poison. Diane McCow leaned forward. "What investors, Margaret? The board hasn't approved any contracts." Realization flashed across Margaret's face, but it was too late. The room broke into a loud chorus of questions and murmurs. "Order! Order!" Margaret yelled, banging the gavel so hard the head snapped off. "I wasn't finished," I said calmly. "While reviewing public records, I discovered something else. 3 months ago, Margaret and her husband created an LLC called Ridgeline Development Partners. I held up a printed document, its key sections highlighted. 2 weeks later, this LLC bought the empty lot next to my property, which would skyrocket in value if a resort were built right next to it." Board member Frank Travers looked stunned. "You told us you sold that lot to a buyer in Arizona."
"Sold the property to your cousin?" Frank asked, incredulous.
"This is character assassination!" Margaret snarled. "No," I said calmly. "It's public record." Diane McCall stood. "I move we adjourn this meeting and suspend all actions related to the proposed development until a full investigation of these allegations is completed." "Seconded," called several voices around a room. "You can't do this!" Margaret's voice rose sharply. "We have deadlines." "What deadlines?" Frank asked. "And what contracts are you referring to?" As board members began questioning each other, I caught sight of Chris Henderson slipping out the side door, phone pressed tightly to his ear. Margaret noticed me watching, and her expression darkened, something cold glinting in her eyes. "This isn't over, Barrett, not by a long shot." As the meeting devolved into chaos, Diane approached me quietly. "You should know, Margaret's been talking to city officials about rezoning the entire area. Whatever she's doing, it's bigger than just your land." I nodded, the pieces finally falling into place. No wonder she'd gone to such extremes. "Thanks for the warning," I said. As neighbors swarmed around me with questions, my phone buzzed with a text from Jacobson. "Don't celebrate yet. Found building permits filed under a different company name. They're targeting Grace's property next. Meet me at the county office ASAP." I looked across the room. Margaret was huddled with Harold and two board members. Despite the massive blow she'd just taken, a faint, smug smile lingered on her lips. I realized with a sinking feeling this battle was far from over. "Get off my property!" I shouted as Margaret's sleek black SUV rolled into my driveway, spitting gravel behind it. The entire HOA board spilled out like angry hornets from a kicked nest. My heart thudded, but I held my ground on the front porch. "We need to talk," Margaret said, her voice colder than a New England January. She gripped a leather folder so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "We've been forced to bring in legal counsel because of your little stunt at the meeting," she added. Behind her stood a man in a tailored suit, clearly uncomfortable and constantly glancing at his watch. "Mr. Peterson," he mumbled, barely making eye contact. "HOA legal counsel." I folded my arms. "Funny, I was just about to call my lawyer, too. Maybe the county assessor and the local news." Margaret's face twitched. The other board members traded nervous glances. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside," Peterson offered, his voice cracking slightly. "No," I said flatly. "We'll talk right here, where the neighbors can see us. I'm done with secret meetings and backroom deals." Next door, Mrs. Garcia stood frozen with her garden hose midair, obviously eavesdropping. Grace had stationed herself in a lawn chair in full view. Even old Mr. Jenkins had cracked his window open, his hearing aid turned up. Peterson cleared his throat. "We've reviewed your documentation. The board is prepared to make a reasonable offer." "Which is?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "We'll drop all claims to your property if you agree to not pursue legal action regarding the structures currently on it." I laughed. "You mean your illegal home addition and the Henderson's pool that crosses onto my property by 8 feet? That's your big offer?" "It's more than fair," board member Keith muttered, though his voice wavered. "And what about the bulldozer that nearly tore up my garden? The repeated noise violations, the threats, the lies to the entire neighborhood about my property line?" Peterson stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Be reasonable. We could tie this up in court for years." "You could try, but I've got a recording of Margaret giving the go-ahead to start construction before it was approved, plus statements from 3 contractors who say they were told to ignore boundary markers." Margaret lurched forward. "You can't prove. And I've got the emails where you discussed how to pressure me into selling.
My cousin in the county clerk's office found them. HOA documents improperly filed become public record after 7 years. Did you know that?" The tension in the air thickened. Peterson leaned in and whispered something urgent to Margaret. Her hair, usually flawless, seemed to droop under the weight of the moment. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice hollow with defeat. I'd been waiting for this. "First," I said, "a legally binding agreement with severe penalties if broken that any new leisure center will be built on designated community land by the front entrance. Second, a revision of the neighborhood's noise rules with real enforcement. Third, you issue a public apology at the next HOA meeting." Tyler, who had been lurking in the background, stepped forward. "That's ridiculous! You can't—" "I'm not finished," I said, still calm. "Fourth, I want a seat on the Architectural Review Committee. And finally, the HOA will create a fund paid from existing reserves for professionally verifying every property line in the neighborhood." "Impossible!" Margaret exploded. "We'd have to raise dues." "Or cut your executive compensation," I suggested with a smile. "Your choice." The group huddled quickly, voices hushed, tension rising. Peterson shook his head. Margaret jabbed a finger toward my house, clearly losing control. Mrs. Garcia had stopped pretending to garden altogether.
Was now openly watching. Grace gave me a thumbs up from her porch. After what felt like an eternity, Margaret returned, her designer heels sinking into my grass. "Fine," she snapped, extending her hand, "but this agreement includes a non-disclosure clause. No one hears about what happened here." I took her cold hand and shook it firmly. "Too late for that. The neighbors already know everything." As the board members shuffled back to their cars, muttering, defeated, I overheard Keith whispered to Margaret, "Why did we agree to all this?" "Because," she hissed back, "he didn't mention the tax reassessment that'll come if he reports the correct property lines to the county. We'd all be ruined." I smiled to myself. I hadn't even thought of that angle. Sometimes the best victories come from letting your enemies imagine their own worst fears. The battle was won, but something in Margaret's eyes as she drove away told me this war wasn't finished. She was already planning her next move. My hand shook as I unfolded the certified letter. It had been 6 months since the showdown. Margaret had vanished from public view, but rumors swept through the neighborhood like dry leaves in the wind. Some said she was building a case against me. Others claimed she'd hired private investigators. The whispers kept me awake most nights. The HOA meeting was tonight. Would she make her move then? I scanned the letterhead and froze. The county tax assessor had completed their review of all Westbrook Grove properties based on updated land surveys. Margaret's home value had shot up by 40% thanks to her undeclared additions crossing onto my land. The Hendersons faced similar spikes. Meanwhile, my own taxes remained unchanged thanks to the historical status Jacobson helped me file for last spring. The doorbell rang, jolting me. I checked the peephole. Tyler Henderson stood alone, shifting uneasily. "What do you want?" I asked, cracking the door just enough to speak. Can we talk?" he asked. He looked different. Humbled almost. "I brought something you need to see." Cautiously, I let him in. He placed a small USB drive on my coffee table. "Margaret's been planning something big," he said, voice low. "Ever since she had to apologize, she's been obsessed with getting revenge. She convinced half the board to back a secret initiative." I picked up the drive.
What's this? Everything. Emails, blueprint, fake documentation. She planned to use it to discredit my property claim. He looked down, ashamed. Samantha and I were part of it until we saw how far she was willing to go. Why turn on her now? Tyler sighed. The tax hike hit us hard. When I asked Margaret for help, she laughed, said we were acceptable casualty damage in her war against you. His eyes met mine. We've got 2 kids heading to college. We can't afford to keep playing along. That evening, the HOA meeting room buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread. Something major was about to unfold. Attendance was unusually high. I spotted the Hendersons seated on the far side of the room, deliberately away from Margaret, who shot them a venomous glare. Grace, now serving as interim president, struck the gavel. Before we begin regular business, I understand Mrs. Winters has an announcement. Margaret strutted to the podium, triumph gleaming in her eyes. After months of investigation, I've uncovered evidence that will shock this community. She pulled a thick folder from her bag. That property survey that caused so much controversy, it was based on fraudulent documentation. Murmurs rippled through the room. My pulse pounded in my ears. I moved that we immediately reverse all decisions based on those false claims and pursue legal action against... I interrupted, rising to my feet. Before the board votes on anything, I believe it should review new evidence that just came to light today. I walked to the projector, plugged in Tyler's USB drive, and brought up the first file. Margaret's face turned chalk white. Her own emails lit up the screen. Messages detailing her plan to forge evidence, manipulate documents, and discredit my ownership. That's not real, she stammered. It came from your own computer, Margaret, Tyler said, now standing beside Samantha. We've submitted sworn statements describing how you asked us to help create the fakes. The room erupted. Board members shouted, homeowners demanded answers. And through the chaos, I caught sight of Peterson, the HOA's lawyer, slipping quietly out the back door.
Rose pounded her gavel several times. Order. As acting president, I move that we immediately suspend Mrs. Winters from the board pending a formal investigation. The vote was unanimous, except for Margaret, who sat frozen in her seat. As the crowd filed out, neighbors who used to avoid me now stopped to chat. Mrs. Langley brought over a plate of homemade cookies. Old Mr. Reynolds clapped me on the shoulder. "You stood up for all of us," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "These fancy newcomers forget what community really means." 2 weeks later, construction crews finally broke ground on the new community leisure center built exactly where it should be, near the front entrance on properly zoned common land, just as I had proposed. The updated noise ordinances had transformed our once rowdy neighborhood into a peaceful haven. Margaret quietly listed her house for sale. A knock at my door revealed Rose, grinning, holding a bottle of champagne and a stack of official-looking papers. "The board voted unanimously," she said proudly. "You're now chairman of the Architectural Review Committee and the newly formed Property Rights Committee." We sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the trees, glasses raised high. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted what was rightfully mine. Rose nodded. "Sometimes the best trap isn't set with anger. It's set with patience. You gave Margaret enough rope, and she hanged herself." As twilight settled over my land that would now remain in my family for generations thanks to its new protected status, my phone buzzed with a message from Vince.
University experts finished analyzing those artifacts Jacobson found. They're not just real, they're rare. The State Historical Society wants to talk about a preservation grant. I laughed aloud. My grandfather always said this land was special, but even he couldn't have guessed just how valuable it would become. Not in dollars, but in legacy and community. The HOA had rushed in hungry for what they thought were easy pickings, never suspecting they were walking into a trap I'd spent months preparing. The sweetest victories aren't won through force, but through wisdom. And sometimes, justice arrives in the most unexpected packages, wrapped in preservation orders that not even the most ruthless HOA can override.